The archival chamber hummed with a low, consistent thrum, a sound Blake had long since ceased to consciously register. It was a symphony of climate control and aging fluorescent lights, a backdrop to the meticulous process of preserving history. Blake, an archivist of some 2 decades, found comfort in the predictable rhythm of the work, the crisp rustle of parchment, the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper, the methodical indexing of forgotten lives. Their station, a polished oak desk scarred by generations of similar work, was a fortress of order amidst the chaotic expanse of human record. Today, however, the order felt fragile. It began with a minor deviation during the recataloguing of Section Gamma 7, a collection of miscellaneous donations deemed too insignificant for individual accession. Blake's gloved fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch required for brittle documents, encountered an anomaly. Tucked away beneath a stack of faded agricultural reports from the mid-20th century lay a small, unadorned wooden box. It was roughly 8 inches square, crafted from an unfamiliar dark wood, its surface smooth and featureless, devoid of clasps or hinges. It simply sat there, a silent, unassuming void in the otherwise overflowing shelves. Blake lifted it. It was heavier than its size suggested, possessing a density that felt almost unnatural. There was no inscription, no label, nothing to indicate its origin or contents. A quick scan of the Gamma 7 manifest yielded no entry for such an item. It was an orphan, an oversight. This alone was enough to pique Blake's professional curiosity. Every item in the archive, no matter how trivial, had a provenance. Placing the box carefully on the desk, he examined it under the focused beam of their task lamp. The wood seemed to absorb the light, reflecting little. As Blake's gaze lingered, a subtle shift occurred at the edge of their vision. The neatly stacked files on an adjacent shelf seemed to ripple, a momentary distortion of their straight lines. He blinked, attributing it to eye strain. The files were, of course, perfectly still. Odd, Blake murmured, the sound swallowed by the chamber's hum. A colleague, a younger archivist named Davies, passed by, pushing a trolley laden with incoming donations. "Find anything interesting, he?" Davies' voice was bright, oblivious. Blake turned, the box momentarily forgotten. Just an unlisted item. An old wooden box. Davies glanced at it, then shrugged. Probably just some personal effects someone forgot to claim. Happens. Davies continued down the aisle. He returned to the box. The distortion had not recurred. He ran a gloved finger over its surface. It was perfectly smooth, no seams, no discernible lid. It was a paradox, a box with no apparent opening. This contradiction, this defiance of expectation, was the first seed of unease. Blake spent the remainder of the afternoon attempting to locate any record of the box, consulting old acquisition logs and cross-referencing donor lists. Nothing. It simply did not exist within the archive's meticulously maintained records. This was not merely an oversight, it was an impossibility. Every item had a story, a path into the collection. This box had none. It was as if it had simply manifested. He found themselves returning to the box repeatedly, not to find an opening, but simply to observe it. As evening approached, the archive gradually emptied. Blake was alone. With a methodical precision that belied a growing tremor in their hands, he picked up the box again. This time, as their fingers closed around it, a faint pressure registered, not physical, but internal. It was as if the box the artifact pulsed, a faint, rhythmic thrumming that Blake felt less in their fingertips and more in the bone behind their eyes. It was not a vibration, not precisely, but a sympathetic resonance, like a distant, low-frequency hum that only their internal organs could register. Sleep had offered no reprieve, only fragmented, unsettling images, vast, empty spaces, geometric shapes that defied Euclidean logic, and a profound, aching loneliness that was not their own. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the marrow, that this was not merely a strange object. It was a key, and whatever door it opened was better left sealed. Yet, a relentless curiosity gnawed at them, an intellectual hunger that eclipsed their mounting fear. Blake had to understand. Their apartment, once a sanctuary of ordered research, now felt too exposed, too fragile. The constant, subtle thrum of the artifact seemed to bleed into the silence, making the walls feel thin, the windows like gaping eyes. They needed isolation, a place where the world's mundane clamor could not interfere with the delicate, terrifying process of uncovering truth. The coastal caves. A remote, desolate stretch known only to a few hardy fishermen and the occasional spelunker. It was perfect. Packing a small bag, Blake included a powerful LED lantern, a notebook, pencils, a few archival tools, brushes, magnifying glass, soft cloths, and a thermos of strong coffee. Each item was chosen with a meticulousness that belied their internal turmoil. They moved with a clinical detachment, as if preparing for a particularly challenging, albeit dangerous, research expedition. The drive out of the city was a blur of highway lights and the incessant, quiet thrum. The landscape gradually gave way to rugged cliffs and a tempestuous, slate-gray sea. Upon arriving at the desolate parking area, a gravel patch clinging precariously to the cliff edge, Blake stepped out into the biting wind. The roar of the ocean was immense, a primordial sound that seemed to swallow all others. The path down to the caves was steep and treacherous, a winding descent marked by loose scree and gnarled, wind-stunted bushes. Blake navigated it with a focused intensity, their determination a shield against the rising tide of unease. This was what they needed. This was where the answers lay, or where their sanity would finally unravel. Water dripped from unseen stalactites, echoing in the vast chamber. They set up their makeshift workstation on a relatively flat, dry slab of rock, carefully unwrapping the artifact. The object seemed to absorb the lantern's light, its surface a dull, unreflective obsidian. Blake began their examination, their archival training kicking in. They used a soft brush to clear away any remaining dust, then the magnifying glass. The surface was impossibly smooth in places, almost liquid, yet in others, it bore intricate, almost imperceptible etchings. Under the intensified light, Blake noticed a pattern that had eluded them before. It was not a symbol, not a script, but a series of interconnected lines, like a microscopic map. These lines converged at specific points, forming nodes, and radiating outwards in a geometry that felt fundamentally wrong, as if drawn by a mind that perceived dimensions differently. As Blake traced the pattern with the tip of a pencil, a faint, almost subliminal shimmer emanated from the artifact. The thrumming intensified, vibrating through the rock beneath them, through their very bones. The air in the cave grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. Blake felt a profound shift in their perception, as if the space around them was expanding, stretching into impossible configurations. The roar of the ocean outside seemed to recede, replaced by a low, guttural murmur that resonated from the very rock walls. Was it the wind? The tide? Or something else entirely? They leaned closer, their breath catching in their throat. And then, the true horror of the connection solidified. The lines on the artifact, the map of impossible geometry, mirrored the faint, almost erased markings on a series of megalithic stones described in an archaeological survey from the 1930s, stones that had vanished without a trace from a remote island off the coast, leaving behind only strange, deep impressions in the earth. The survey had attributed their disappearance to erosion, or perhaps theft. Blake now understood that was a lie. The revelation was not a sudden burst of insight, but a slow, crushing realization that pressed down on them, stealing their breath. This artifact was not merely old, it was ancient, predating recorded history, and it was a blueprint, a key, to something vast and terrible that lay hidden beneath the world's surface, hinted at by forgotten charts and vanished monoliths. The megaliths hadn't eroded, they had been taken, perhaps by the very force that had shaped this artifact. The cave began to breathe. The air grew frigid, despite the dampness. The murmuring sound intensified, no longer from the walls, but from deep within their own skull. It was a language without words, a concept without form, an immense, silent scream. Was this real? Were these connections genuine, or was the artifact poisoning their mind, unraveling the very threads of their sanity? They were alone here, utterly isolated, with only the pulsing artifact and the growing certainty that they had stumbled upon something that humanity was never meant to comprehend. Yet, the determination, now tinged with a desperate, self-destructive compulsion, refused to yield. They had to know more. They had to. Nagging doubt that eroded Blake's confidence. They began to question their own memories, small details of their routine, the exact placement of files, the precise wording of instructions. Had the archive always been this silent? Had the fluorescent lights always hummed with such an insistent drone? His determination to understand the box now mingled with a desperate need to understand the shifting landscape of their own sanity. The isolation deepened. Blake started taking meals alone, avoiding the break room, where the mundane chatter of colleagues felt jarring, unreal. They spent their evenings in the archive, long after everyone else had left, bathed in the cool, blue light of the task lamp, fixated on the enigmatic box. The recursive pattern became clearer, more insistent. It was not merely a design, it was a language, a silent, visual dialect that spoke of impossible dimensions and non-Euclidean spaces. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that the box was not merely an object to be catalogued. It was a catalyst. It was slowly, meticulously, dismantling the established architecture of Blake's reality. And he, despite the growing terror, could not look away. The truth, however unsettling, held an irresistible allure. The direct manifestations began subtly, then with terrifying intensity. Blake had been tracing the shifting patterns on the box for hours, fingers hovering inches above its surface, when a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the wood. It was not a vibration, but a shift in its inherent stillness, as if the material itself was breathing. He leaned closer, their breath held. Suddenly, a seam appeared on the box. It was as if the box was momentarily revealing its true, alien geometry, a glimpse into its impossible interior. A sound, not heard but felt, resonated in his skull, a low, resonant thrum, like the universe itself vibrating on an unheard frequency. The air in the archive grew heavy, charged with an unknown energy. The box responded. It was not a physical form, but an impression, a shadow cast from a dimension beyond human comprehension. It had no discernible features, no limbs, no head, yet Blake felt an undeniable, crushing presence, an intelligence that dwarfed all human understanding. This was the cosmic horror. It was not a monster with teeth and claws, but a fundamental truth, a reality that had always existed, veiled by the comforting illusions of human perception. The box was not an artifact that contained the horror, it was an artifact that revealed it, by stripping away the layers of his conditioned reality. Blake felt their minds splintering. The familiar walls of the archive seemed to melt and flow, the shelves twisting into grotesque parodies of themselves. The meticulous order he had cherished dissolved into chaos. Memories, once firm and reliable, now flickered like dying embers, their authenticity questioned by the overwhelming presence. He was no longer in the archive, but suspended sleep had offered no cessation to the internal thrumming. Blake had tried. Hours spent in a rigid, supine position, eyes pressed shut, had only amplified the artifact's resonant frequency. It was not a sound one heard with ears, but a pressure behind the optic nerves, a persistent, low-frequency tremor that vibrated the very fluid within their skull. The previous night had been a tapestry of fragmented images and half-formed thoughts, none of them their own, all accompanied by that insistent hum. Blake rose, muscles stiff, skin clammy. The archivist's apartment, usually a sanctuary of ordered chaos, now felt like a temporary holding cell. Every object, every book on the shelf, seemed to pulse with a faint, sympathetic energy, their edges blurring just at the periphery of Blake's vision. They ran a hand over their stubbled jaw, the rough texture unfamiliar. The reflection in the darkened window showed a gaunt face, eyes wide and bloodshot, but beneath the exhaustion, a strange determination flickered. Blake had to understand. This wasn't just an object, it was a key, a conduit, or perhaps a mirror reflecting something fundamental. The artifact, resting on the polished oak table, no longer appeared inert. It seemed to inhale and exhale, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the thrumming in Blake's bones. Its surface, once smooth and obsidian, now seemed to ripple, the light playing tricks, showing impossible depths within its solid form. Blake picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, but the weight felt less like mass and more like an anchor, pulling them towards an unknown destination. A whisper, faint and dry like sand, seemed to emanate from it, forming words just beyond comprehension, dissolving before they could fully register. Blake felt a distinct pull, a vector of compulsion that was both physical and cognitive. It was not a thought, but an absolute certainty that a specific location held the next piece of this disintegrating puzzle. The coastal caves. The name materialized in their mind, unbidden, yet undeniably correct. Blake packed a small satchel with a meager supply of water, a flashlight, and a worn compass, though they knew navigation would be irrelevant where they were headed. The world was already shifting, and conventional tools felt like quaint relics. The drive was a blur of distorted landscapes. Telephone poles leaned at impossible angles, their wires singing a cacophony that mimicked the artifact's hum. The asphalt ahead seemed to undulate, a black serpent coiling into the distance. The air conditioning unit in the car whirred, and for a moment, Blake heard a distinct chuckle emanating from the vents, a dry, mocking sound that prickled their scalp. They pressed harder on the accelerator, a desperate need to reach the caves overriding all other sensations. Upon arrival, the air was thick with brine and the damp smell of ancient rock. The wind, usually a bracing companion, felt like a caress from something vast and unseen. The waves crashed against the shore, a relentless, rhythmic roar that quickly began to synchronize with the artifact's internal hum, creating a monstrous, unified pulse. They pressed deeper, the beam of light dancing across ancient formations, stalactites like petrified teeth, stalagmites like reaching fingers. Blake stopped in a vast chamber, the ceiling lost to the gloom, the floor a slick expanse of wet sand and scattered pebbles. The artifact in their hand pulsed with renewed vigor, its thrumming now a deafening internal roar. It was not human speech, yet Blake understood it with an horrifying clarity. It spoke of cycles, of forgotten beginnings, of the fragile illusion of form. Blake's reflection in a shallow pool of water was no longer entirely their own. The contours of their face seemed to ripple, to melt, to become indistinct. Blake's identity, once a fixed point, dissolved like salt in the encroaching tide. The I became a fluid concept, interchangeable with the vast, ancient presence that now permeated the caves, the ocean, and the very air. The horror was no longer an external threat, but a fundamental truth of existence that had finally broken through the thin veneer of perceived reality. Blake was not merely observing it, they were becoming it, or perhaps, realizing they had always been a part of it. The lines blurred. The caves were not just stone, they were a living, breathing entity, and Blake, the archivist, was merely a conduit, a single, fleeting thought in its incomprehensible mind. The determination that had propelled them here was not their own, but an echo of the greater, insatiable will that now manifested through their shattered perception. The full, awful truth of the cosmic horror lay not in some monstrous form, but in the absolute, undeniable revelation that sanity itself was the most delicate, most arbitrary construct, and that beyond it, lay only the vast, indifferent truth. Blake opened their mouth, but no sound emerged, only the resonant thrumming of the artifact, now an extension of their own being, vibrating with the silent, terrible song of the universe. Between two territories. For he, however, it was the culmination of everything. The air here was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of imminence. The concrete barriers, the chain-link fences, the watchful eyes of the border officials, these were not merely physical obstacles, but symbolic boundaries, thin veils separating one reality from another. Blake approached the booth. The border officials face a study in bureaucratic neutrality. The man's uniform, his badge, his very posture, seemed to vibrate with the same impossible geometry he had seen on the box. He was not just a man, he was a manifestation, a gatekeeper between states of being. "Papers, please," the official stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Blake reached into their pocket, their hand moving as if of its own accord. There were no papers. There was only the sensation of infinite space, of an identity that had shattered and reformed into something new, something that transcended the need for documentation. The official's gaze sharpened, not with suspicion, but with a profound, unsettling recognition. His eyes, for a fleeting moment, seemed to hold the same ancient, unknowable patterns he had perceived in the box. He saw not Blake, the archivist, but something else entirely. "I just need to cross," he stated, their voice hollow, echoing with the vastness of the cosmos. The words were not a request, but a statement of inherent truth. The crossing was inevitable. The official, after a moment of unsettling stillness, simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to carry the weight of eons. "Proceed." Blake walked forward, past the barrier, past the watchful eyes, past the queued vehicles. The air on the other side of the checkpoint was identical, the road stretched out in the same manner, the landscape was indistinguishable. Yet, everything was profoundly different. The colors of the sky were no longer mere hues, they were vibrations, frequencies of an incomprehensible spectrum. The sound of the wind was not merely air moving, but a symphony of cosmic breath, carrying whispers of realities that folded into themselves. He saw the patterns now, everywhere. The dust motes dancing in the sunlight were not random, they traced intricate, recursive geometries. Blake's identity, once a singular, defined construct, had dissolved completely. There was no longer he the archivist, the meticulous keeper of records. There was only perception, a vast, unbounded awareness that encompassed all that was and all that could be. Blake was no longer an individual observing the cosmic horror, he was the cosmic horror, or at least, a fragment of its infinite, indifferent consciousness. The wooden box, the catalyst, was gone. It had never been a physical object in the conventional sense, but a key, a focal point for the shift. Now, the entire world was the box, and Blake was inside, outside, and everywhere in between. He continued walking, one foot after the other, the rhythm of their steps echoing the silent pulse of the universe. They had crossed the border, not into another country, but into another reality. The horror was not an event that had ended, it was the fundamental state of being, now fully apprehended. The archivist had become the archive, a living repository of infinite, incomprehensible truths. The road stretched onward, seemingly endless, under a sky that throbbed with silent, alien light. Blake felt no fear, no joy, no sadness. Only a vast, crushing indifference. The destination was not a place, but a state of being. And he, or what remained of Blake, had arrived. The cosmic entity had found its vessel, its new point of observation in a reality that had always been its own.